Good evening, dear friends, and welcome back. Tonight, I invite you to settle into the gentlest of scenes, an autumn evening where the air is crisp, the leaves whisper against cobbled lanes, and a cup of tea sends up its comforting steam. Imagine yourself beside a fire, the glow soft against the window panes, as stories unfold the way they often do in small English villages, quietly, but never without secrets. Our tale tonight is The House That Kept Deadly Secrets, a Miss Marple mystery. A story of charm entwined with shadows, where every creak of a floorboard might conceal a truth long buried. Tell me, if you spent a night in an old manor, would you feel enchanted or unsettled? At the edge of St. Alders, where the fields meet the mist and the hedgerows lean into the wind, there stands a house the villagers seldom speak of. Its shutters are drawn as though in eternal sleep, ivy clinging to stone walls like grasping fingers. The slate roof sighs under the weight of autumn rain, and when dusk falls, the manor appears less like a home and more like a figure watching the village in silence. Step closer, and the air seems different, thicker, carrying the scent of damp earth and something unspoken. Behind those shuttered windows lies a room once lit by candle flame, where laughter turned to whispers and whispers to cries. One villager, trudging home late across the lane, swears he heard the tread of footsteps pacing those empty halls. Another insists a shadow passed by the upper window, though the place has been abandoned for years. It is the kind of house that appears in stories told over pints and tea, the kind that draws shivers even on the warmest night. And yet, within its silence, something stays, waiting, watching, ready at last for its secrets to be heard. Chapter 1. A Village at Rest, a Shadow at the Gate. There are places in England that seem untouched by time, where the seasons turn with gentle rhythm and life moves to the cadence of church bells and market chatter. St. Alders was one of these places. Nestled in a dip of rolling countryside, the village looked as though it had stepped straight from a painting. Thatched cottages leaning slightly from centuries of weather, gardens bursting with hollyhocks and lavender, cobbled lanes twisting toward the green at its heart. The air always seemed tinged with wood smoke and fresh bread, and the pub, the King's Lantern, remained the hub of every whispered tale and hearty laugh. The people of St. Alders carried the kind of familiarity that bred both comfort and curiosity. Old Mr. Perry opened his shop at dawn, rain or shine, his spectacles perpetually sliding down his nose as he wrapped paper parcels of barley sugar for children. Mrs. Linton arranged flowers on her stoop each morning, rosies even in the coldest months, insisting they brightened the whole street. On Sundays, villagers filled the pews of the modest stone church, hymns drifting over the hedgerows while sheep grazed idly on the hills. It was a life measured not in haste, but in small rituals that kept everything turning smoothly, predictably. Yet, in every village, there are corners the eye avoids. For St. Alders, it was the house at the edge of the lane leading toward the marsh. Locals called it Ashcroft Manor, though few used the name aloud. It stood slightly apart, framed by tall yews that rattled when the wind pressed through. From the green, one could just glimpse its gables jutting against the horizon, its windows closed and staring as if guarding themselves. Children dared each other to run past its iron gate after dusk, always breathless with a fear they could not name. The manor had been unoccupied for years, or so the story went. Some said it was cursed, others simply claimed it was unlucky, a place that brought sorrow to whoever stepped through its door. But the truth was simpler, no one wanted it. Its upkeep was daunting, its halls cold and draught-prone, and its history, well, that was something villagers only hinted at after their second pint. And yet, despite its silence, the house belonged to the village's rhythm in its own way. On market days, when stalls brimmed with root vegetables, spiced biscuits, and skeins of wool, the conversation inevitably bent toward the manor. a glimpse of a shutter not quite closed, a rumor that a light had flickered one stormy night, the notion that ivy did not merely grow across its walls but tightened, as if trying to keep whatever lay within from ever escaping. For Miss Marple, visiting her old friend Mrs. Ellery for a season, St. Alders presented a charm that felt almost storybook. She relished the walks along hedgerows, the tea served in delicate porcelain, the village gossip that wove tales out of the smallest oddity. But she, perhaps more than any other, noticed how often the villagers' conversations turned away, too quickly, whenever Ashcroft Manor was mentioned. To Jane Marple's trained eye, avoidance was as telling as admission. So the house waited at the edge of St. Alders, its shadow stretching long across the fields at twilight. The village itself hummed with life, content in its timeless patterns, unaware that beneath its quiet surface, change was already stirring. For when a community guards its silence too closely, secrets do not stay buried forever. They have a way of pressing upward, like roots breaking through stone, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. It was on a rain-slick Tuesday that the rhythm of St. Alders shifted. A stranger stepped off the midday coach, his coat heavy with city drizzle, a leather satchel tucked close beneath his arm. His name was Mr. Edmund Hale, a historian from London with a scholarly air and the faint impatience of someone unused to village pace. While most travelers passed through St. Alders on their way to the coast, Hale had come for a purpose. He carried with him fragments of records, brittle parish notes, and forgotten deeds that all pointed toward the same place, Ashcroft Manor. By supper, his arrival was already the talk of the King's Lantern. The pub, golden with firelight, buzzed as villagers nursed their pints and speculated on what business a London man might have with their long-abandoned house. Some said he was chasing ghosts, others that he must be connected to the family who once lived there. The landlord, polishing glasses behind the bar, muttered that no good ever came of stirring ashes better left untouched. At a small corner table, Miss Marple sat beside her friend Mrs. Ellery, sipping tea rather than ale. Her knitting needles clicked gently as she listened, though her eyes rarely lifted from the wall. She knew from long experience that a roomful of villagers, once loosened by curiosity, would reveal more than they intended. Sure enough, fragments of half-remembered tales began to tumble forth. One man recalled his father warning him never to linger near the manor after dark. A woman insisted her aunt had once served there, though she fell curiously silent when pressed about what had driven her away. Laughter masked unease, but the more they spoke, the clearer it became. Ashcroft Manor was not merely empty stone, but a vessel of memory, unsettled, unspoken, and very much alive in the villagers' minds. Mr. Hale arrived at the pub later that evening, stamping the mud from his boots. He greeted the room with polite formality, ordered a simple meal, and unfolded his notes at the table. To most, he looked like any academic, absorbed in ink and paper. But Miss Marple, watching over her spectacles, noticed the subtle spark of excitement in his expression as he read. She guessed, rightly, that he had uncovered something tantalizing, and that he would not rest until the mystery yielded its truth. The room grew quieter as villagers stole glances at him. Whispers traveled like smoke. Why dig up old bones? What if he finds something best forgotten? Yet curiosity was a powerful current, and within days, the historian's presence began to stir corners of memory that had long lain dormant. Miss Marple, ever the quiet observer, said little, but she tucked away each remark, each hesitation, each wary glance exchanged across the pub. For while Hale sought his answers in papers and records, she knew the living held as many clues as the dead. The house at the edge of St. Alders was waking in the minds of its people, and once awakened, such things seldom returned to sleep. Chapter 2. Echoes in the Walls. It was Mr. Hale who first crossed the threshold of Ashcroft Manor. The villagers watched from a careful distance as he took the iron key, rusted and reluctant, from the parish chest and worked it into the lock. The door groaned as though resisting intrusion, and when it finally swung open, a breath of stale air drifted outward, carrying the scent of dust, mildew, and something faintly metallic, like old blood on iron. Inside, time had done its quiet work. The entrance hall stretched wide, its once polished floors dulled beneath a film of neglect. A grand staircase rose at the center, its banister lined with cobwebs like faded lace. Sunlight forced its way through gaps in the shutters, cutting long slashes across faded wallpaper and scattering light upon the portraits that stared down from the walls. Those portraits were the first to unsettle Hale. Men in somber coats, women with guarded eyes, children stiff in formal dress, all gazed outward as if holding secrets behind painted silence. Their faces were cracked by age, yet there was something in their expressions that felt almost alive, almost accusing. He lingered before them longer than he meant to, shivering as though they followed him across the room. Miss Marple joined him later that afternoon. Outwardly, she admired the craftsmanship of the old woodwork, noted the fine, if frayed, Persian rug sprawled across the drawing room, and remarked on the house's splendid bones. But while her words were light, her eyes darted quickly, registering details Hale overlooked. A fireplace that had been used more recently than the rest of the room suggested. A candlestick out of place. A faint trail of scuff marks leading toward a locked door. The historian, absorbed in his notes, explained that the house had once belonged to the Ashcroft family, prosperous landowners whose presence in the village dwindled mysteriously some 80 years ago. Financial ruin, he murmured, tracing his finger along a ledger he'd brought. But the records are incomplete, abruptly cut off, as though something interrupted them. Marple nodded politely, though her gaze lingered on the heavy curtains that smelled faintly of smoke, as though they had once hidden more than dust. Together, they moved from room to room. The dining hall's long table was still set with a tarnished candelabrum, wax-hardened into frozen drips. A sideboard bore the remains of porcelain dishes, some shattered, some chipped, as if dinner had been interrupted in haste. In the library, shelves sagged beneath the weight of mildewed volumes, and papers lay strewn across the desk, the ink blurred with damp, as if someone had searched in desperation before abandoning it. And then, the locked doors. Several of them lined the upper corridor, their keys long missing. Hale rattled the handles, frustration mounting, while Marple merely folded her hands and observed. To her mind, locked doors did not simply guard empty rooms. They guarded stories people were determined not to let slip free. It was outside, however, that her sharp eyes noticed the most telling sign. While Hale sketched the outlines of the building, she wandered to the overgrown garden. Brambles had swallowed most of the flower beds, and ivy clawed at stone statues worn faceless by weather. Yet in one corner, where the earth was damp from recent rains, she saw a patch of soil not as wild as the rest, disturbed, as though turned by a spade not long ago. She said nothing, only smoothed the soil gently with the toe of a shoe and returned to Hale with a pleasant smile. But within her mind, the thought had already begun to root. The house might appear abandoned, but someone had been here. And where the living linger among the dead, there are always secrets waiting to be unearthed. The following week brought rain, and with it, a discovery. Mr. Hale, diligent as ever, requested permission to search the parish archives, a cramped room above the vestry where ledgers and letters had been gathering dust for generations. He sat for hours by the dim light of a single lamp, combing through brittle pages. Most were ordinary records, births, marriages, harvest accounts, but at the bottom of one box lay a bundle of letters tied with discolored ribbon. Their edges were frayed, the ink faded, but Hale recognized at once that they bore the Ashcroft name. The letters spoke not of finances or land, but of a household unraveling. One hinted at quarrels between siblings, another referred to debts best not spoken of in polite company. But it was a particular note, scrawled hastily and unsigned, that chilled him. She refuses to leave her chamber. The door is locked from within. If the truth emerges, all will be undone. By evening, word of Hale's find had slipped into the village like a draught through a cracked window. At the king's lantern, whispers grew louder, swelling until half the room buzzed with conjecture. Mrs. Linton swore her grandmother once told her of the widow who never left her room, a woman who drew the curtains and refused food save for bread and broth passed through the door. Others spoke of a child who vanished one winter without explanation. Some claimed fever, others insisted kidnapping, but no body had ever been buried in the churchyard. Miss Marple, present once again with her knitting, listened as these fragments stitched themselves into uneasy patterns. She noticed how certain villagers leaned in close to whisper, lowering their voices not for secrecy, but out of superstition, as if even the walls might overhear. Old tales had a way of growing, but beneath the embellishments, she recognized a thread of truth. Trauma leaves traces, however faint, in the memory of a community. When Hale entered, soaked from rain and still clutching the bundle of letters, the pub quieted. He spoke little, only remarking that history was rarely as tidy as we would prefer. Yet his presence alone confirmed to the villagers that something of weight had been uncovered. Their eyes flickered nervously toward the direction of Ashcroft Manor, looming unseen beyond the hedges, as though the house itself might rouse at the mention of its secrets. Miss Marple asked no direct questions, but later, as she and Mrs. Ellery walked home beneath dripping branches, she mused aloud about the curious human habit of locking things away. Letters in boxes, widows in rooms, children in silence. Mrs. Ellery shivered and asked her to stop. She did not like to think of the manor, not at night. And so, tension began to coil through St. Alders. What had seemed merely an abandoned building was now a vessel of tragedy, its shadow lengthening across the village's peace. The whispers no longer carried the tone of idle gossip. They had become something darker, weighted with unease. For when the past begins to stir, it seldom does so without reaching into the present, pulling it toward revelations long delayed. The rain had cleared by the next afternoon, leaving the village washed and glistening, every leaf dripping with silver. Mr. Hale wasted no time returning to the manor, and Miss Marple, with her unassuming curiosity, accompanied him. Though she spoke of enjoying a brisk walk, her eyes betrayed a sharper purpose. She wished to see the house again, this time with the village's whispers echoing in her mind. Inside, the manor seemed unchanged at first glance. Silent halls, dust thick on the floors, the faint chill of neglect seeping into their bones. Yet for one so practiced in observation as Miss Marple, it took little time to notice what did not fit. In the drawing room, a tall brass candlestick rested not upon the mantel, where its twin still stood, but on the floor beside a chair. A careless detail, perhaps, yet the dust beneath it was disturbed in a way that suggested recent movement. She stooped slightly, running a gloved finger across the base. The mark was clean, too clean, as if someone had set it down only days before. She straightened, her expression mild, while Hale rattled off notes about paneling and Georgian symmetry, oblivious to the tiny dissonance. In the corridor, the story repeated itself. The shutters in one room had been pried open just enough to let in a blade of light. Dust lay thick across the sill, but the center bore faint smudges, as though fingertips had pressed there. A chair had been moved slightly from its usual place, leaving a clear outline on the rug. The smallest signs, insignificant to most, but to Miss Marple they spoke in whispers louder than words. Someone had been here. She said nothing outright, only asked Hale whether he thought the house might have been used by squatters at some point. He dismissed the notion. Too remote, too inhospitable. But she noticed how quickly he moved on, unwilling to dwell on the idea. They explored further, and in one of the upper rooms, she paused at the faint scent of smoke. The hearth was cold, but not so long cold as the others. Ash still bore a ghost of white, not entirely settled. Her heart quickened, though her voice remained calm as she remarked how remarkable it was, how fireplaces hold their scent. Hale barely nodded, absorbed in photographing a faded crest above the mantel. By the time they left, shadows stretched across the fields, and the house once more appeared silent, empty, untouched. But Miss Marple knew better. The candlestick, the smudged shutters, the not yet forgotten fire. These were not accidents of neglect. They were signs of life, small but undeniable. Someone, for reasons unknown, was still moving through Ashcroft Manor's rooms. Someone who did not wish to be seen. Chapter 3. Layers of Deception. Mr. Hale returned from the manor one blustery morning with his spectacles askew and his satchel bulging with papers. The villagers saw him stride across the green with an expression of triumph half hidden beneath weariness, and before long the king's lantern was abuzz with speculation. Yet the historian kept his findings close, revealing them only later that evening to Miss Marple, who received him with tea and quiet patience. From his satchel he drew a slim leather-bound ledger, its spine cracked, its pages stiff with age. He explained that it had been discovered in the library, wedged behind a row of decaying hymnals as though purposefully concealed. The ink was faded, but legible enough. Entries of payments, debts, and notes that painted a picture quite unlike the genteel image the Ashcrofts had long projected. The first pages spoke of generosity, charitable donations to the parish, commissions for local craftsmen. But as the years progressed, the tone shifted. Payments grew irregular, sums larger, annotations sharper. The family's estate, it seemed, had been crumbling beneath the veneer of prosperity. Then came the entries that chilled both reader and listener. A note marked in a hurried hand, brother dispute settlement. Threats exchanged. Silence necessary until papers signed. Another, weeks later, funds diverted. Cannot allow discovery. The handwriting itself became erratic, as though written in agitation or fear. And then, abruptly, nothing. The ledger stopped mid-sentence, the ink trailing to a jagged halt, the final line reading only, "If this continues." Hale's eyes gleamed with the thrill of it. "You see, Miss Marple, there's a pattern of betrayal here. Family against family. Secrets bound in money and silence. One does not hide such a ledger unless one fears what it reveals." Miss Marple listened, nodding faintly, but her gaze was on the edge of the page, where faint water stains had blurred a few words. To her, the omission was as telling as the entries themselves. Records cut short without resolution suggested not merely neglect but deliberate concealment. Hale speculated freely. Perhaps there had been embezzlement. Perhaps a quarrel that led to violence. He spoke of motives piling upon motives. Inheritance, jealousy, debts that could ruin reputations. His voice carried the enthusiasm of an academic piecing together a puzzle. Yet beneath it lay something darker. The realization that the Ashcroft collapse had not been a gentle decline, but a sudden severing. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, remarked gently, "Families often fall apart not from lack of love, but from pride and the fear of shame. It can drive even the most respectable into curious actions." She said no more, but Hale noted the glint in her eyes. She was already considering not just numbers in a ledger, but the human frailties behind them. Over the next days, he traced connections in the village records. A sudden sale of livestock, properties transferred hastily into other names, and then most curious of all, a complete absence of correspondence. The Ashcrofts, once prolific letter-writers, seemed to vanish from ink and parchment altogether, as though their voices had been silenced at once. To Hale, it suggested conspiracy. To Marple, tragedy. Both, however, agreed on one thing. The sudden cut-off was no accident. When news of Hale's find trickled into the pub, the whispers sharpened. The villagers spoke more freely now of the vanished child, the reclusive widow, the sense that the house itself had turned hostile. And though they cloaked their unease in gossip, the truth pressed closer with every telling. The Ashcroft had left behind more than dust. They had left behind a story carefully hidden, one that someone, even now, might still wish to protect. Miss Marple often said that villages were much like families. Everyone knew everyone's business. And yet, curiously, the most important matters were the ones never spoken aloud. In St. Alders, this truth proved itself daily. The more the Ashcroft mystery bubbled through conversation, the more the villagers contradicted one another without even realizing. At the King's Lantern, she sat quietly in her favored corner, knitting needles clicking softly, while voices rose and fell around her. Mrs. Linton claimed with certainty that the Ashcroft child, little Thomas, she believed, had died of fever one winter. But only minutes later, old Mr. Perry insisted no such fever had ever touched the village, not in his father's time, not in living memory. His recollection was sharp, unwavering. Another villager, flushed from ale, swore the child had been sent away to relatives in the north. Yet when pressed by his companions, he faltered, unable to name which relatives, or why they had never returned for visits. Each version of events tangled against the others, and Miss Marple, eyes lowered to her knitting, quietly stored them away. She began to pose the gentlest of questions. "And did your grandmother ever speak of the child?" she asked Mrs. Linton, her voice light, almost distracted. The woman hesitated just long enough for Marple to notice before replying that her grandmother rarely spoke of unpleasant matters. To Mr. Perry she remarked, "How curious that a fever should be forgotten. Perhaps you are mistaken." His indignant denial only confirmed for her that he was not. What struck her most, however, was not the contradictions themselves but the unease that accompanied them. Each villager grew tense when the child was mentioned, their voices lowering, their glances darting to the corners of the room. It was not the natural fading of memory, but the deliberate blurring of it. Someone, perhaps many, were hiding knowledge, and hiding, in her experience, rarely came without reason. One evening, as Hale read aloud a passage from the ledger, noting the abrupt halt in correspondence, Miss Marple observed the room closely. A particular villager, Mr. Cottrell, shifted uncomfortably each time the child was referenced, his eyes fixed firmly on his glass. When someone joked about ghostly footsteps of the lost heir, Cottrell barked a laugh too loud, too forced, then quickly excused himself. To most, it was nothing. To Miss Marple, it was everything. Later, as she and Mrs. Ellie walked home under a half-moon sky, Marple mused aloud. "The truth, my dear, is much like a quilt. The pattern seems clear from a distance, but when you step closer, you see where stitches have been pulled out and replaced." Mrs. Ellery sighed, remarking that she wished the whole matter would fade back into silence. But Jane Marple knew silence was merely another form of speech, one that required careful translation. By now, the contradictions were too numerous to be coincidence. Fever, travel, vanishing, each tale concealed more than it revealed. The vanished child was not simply forgotten, he had been deliberately obscured. And somewhere in the shadows of the manor, and in the guarded hearts of the villagers, lay the answer to why. It was near the end of October when the first report came. A farmhand, trudging home late after tending to his sheep, swore he had seen a glow flickering in the windows of Ashcroft Manor. At first, the villagers dismissed it as drink or moonlight, but the boy was adamant. Lantern light, he insisted, moving, as if carried by a hand. His words spread quickly, stirring a fresh ripple of unease. The following evening, curiosity kept several villagers awake longer than usual. Curtains twitched, lamps burned late, and more than one pair of eyes turned toward the manor's dark silhouette against the horizon. The air was sharp with frost, the fields silvered under a rising moon. And then, faint but distinct, a sound drifted across the stillness. Music, thin and wavering, like an old gramophone winding through a melancholy tune. Miss Marple, standing with Mrs. Ellery in the garden, paused mid-sentence. Her sharp ears caught the strains, and though Mrs. Ellery declared it impossible, Jane said nothing. Instead, she borrowed a shawl and walked quietly toward the hedgerow where the view of the manor was clearest. From her vantage, the house loomed spectral, its shutters like closed eyelids. Yet as she watched, a shadow passed behind one of the upper windows, indistinct but unmistakable. Not the flicker of tree branches, not a trick of light, but the deliberate movement of a human form. She felt no fear, only the sharpened alertness of recognition. Someone was indeed within those walls, not merely a drifter seeking shelter, for who among wanderers carried gramophones? No, this was something else, someone tied to the house itself, drawn back to its silence and secrecy. When she returned to Mrs. Ellery, she merely said, "Strange, how sound can carry on such still nights." She did not mention the shadow. The next morning, villagers buzzed over what they had, or had not, heard. Some claimed it was owls, others the wind in the chimney. But the more they denied, the more the fear took root. For Miss Marple, the conclusion was clear. Ashcroft Manor was not empty. It had never been empty. Chapter 4. Secrets Unearthed. The discovery came on a raw November morning, when the wind rattled the yews around Ashcroft Manor and sent a mournful whistle through its chimney stacks. Mr. Hale had grown increasingly restless, determined to unpick the silence of the locked rooms. With the help of the parish clerk, he managed to force open one panel in the upper corridor, where the wallpaper had bubbled oddly against the wood. Behind it, instead of plaster, lay a narrow cavity stuffed with dust and forgotten objects. At the back rested a slim leather volume, its cover brittle, its clasp tarnished green with age. A diary. The historian's hands trembled as he brought it into the drawing-room, laying it gently upon the table as though it were a sacred relic. Miss Marple, who had joined him that morning under the pretense of stretching her legs, watched keenly as he eased open its pages. The handwriting was delicate yet erratic, penned by a woman whose emotions seemed to spill across the paper. The entries began calmly enough. The writer, unnamed but unmistakably the widow spoken of in village whispers, described the oppressive quiet of the house after her husband's death. She wrote of closing her shutters, of avoiding company, of finding little comfort in either church or garden. But as the pages turned, her tone darkened. One entry read, "They betray me in whispers. I hear them through the floorboards. My own blood conspires, smiling in daylight, plotting in the shadows." Another, "Something has been taken. They think me blind, but I saw the carriage that night. I heard the storm and the door slammed shut forever. They will not speak of it, but I know." Hale leaned closer, muttering about possible reference to financial theft, but Miss Marple frowned slightly. To her, the words bore not only the weight of money but of something more intimate, family, pride, and loss. The diary grew increasingly fragmented. Some passages descended into near madness, looping sentences and repeated phrases. The child cries in the walls, the house remembers. I will not forget. Yet amid the disjointed grief lay pointed remarks, references to names struck through, to quarrels muffled but never resolved. One particular entry chilled them both. He said it must remain hidden, for the family's honor. He pressed the key into his pocket and turned the lock, leaving me with silence. I am left only with my sorrow, pacing these rooms while they walk free. By the time they reached the final pages, the handwriting had become so unstable it seemed almost illegible, the ink blotted as though tears had fallen onto the page. The last coherent sentence read, "If the truth lies buried, then so shall I." After that, nothing but blank leaves, waiting, as if the rest had been torn away. Hale spoke with the excitement of discovery, listing possible interpretations, madness born of isolation, or evidence of a cover-up surrounding the missing child. But Miss Marple, with her quiet intuition, felt something more personal thrumming beneath the widow's words. The repeated references to something taken, the stormy night, the locked door, these were not delusions alone. They were fragments of truth wrapped in grief, a truth no one had dared to acknowledge. Holding the fragile volume in her lap, she traced the faded ink with one gloved finger and murmured softly, "People may lock away their diaries, but they seldom lie to themselves within them." The house, it seemed, had guarded this testimony for decades. Now, released from its hidden cavity, the widow's voice had returned to speak, accusing, lamenting, and guiding those who listened toward the shadowed heart of Ashcroft Manor. Miss Marple had often remarked that truth rarely shouts. It whispers, concealed beneath the ordinary. As Mr. Hale pored over the widow's diary, eager to match its references with parish records and legal documents, Jane Marple sat quietly, her eyes scanning the pages not for names or dates, but for rhythm, for pattern. To her, the diary was less a ledger of events than a tapestry of careful omissions. And hidden within its loops and repetitions, she recognized something far more deliberate, a confession in disguise. Certain phrases repeated themselves with curious insistence. The child cries in the walls. The storm took him. Honor must be kept, though innocence is lost. To Hale, they sounded like the ravings of grief. But to Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime listening to the polite evasions of neighbors, the words carried a familiar cadence. They were not madness. They were codes, cloaked in metaphor, the widow's only safe means of setting her truth down on paper. She recalled village gossip about the missing child, the contradictions that circled his fate. The widow's insistence that something was taken seemed less like metaphorical display and more like literal theft. Not of jewels, not of property, but of blood, a child taken from his mother, spirited away in secrecy. Miss Marple gently drew Hale's attention to a particular passage. He pressed the key into his pocket and turned the lock, leaving me with silence. Hale speculated it meant confinement of the widow herself, an attempt to stifle her voice. Marple, however, softly suggested another reading. Perhaps it was the child who had been locked away, his fate decided by the family's desperate desire to preserve reputation. The more she examined the diary, the more the widow's seemingly erratic script revealed a logic of concealment. Mentions of storms coincided with dates of sudden family absences. References to the house remembering pointed to hidden chambers, locked rooms perhaps, or concealed spaces within the manor walls. And always, threaded through, the widow's grief over something torn from her. My arms were emptied, yet the cradle still rocks in my dreams. It was a confession, yes, but not hers. It was the family's, transcribed through her sorrow. She had borne witness to a crime, the disappearance of a child, covered up beneath the polite veneer of lineage and honor. Unable to speak it openly, she transformed her diary into a cipher, trusting that someday, someone might read between the lines. Miss Marple laid her knitting aside and looked at Hale with her clear, penetrating eyes. "You see, Mr. Hale," she murmured, "in villages and in families, one does not speak of scandals. But one writes of them, obliquely. One scratches them into margins, cloaks them in poetry, and lets them rest where only the most persistent might discover them. This diary is less the ramblings of a lonely widow than her testament. She is telling us that something very dark was hidden here, and that she was made complicit in its silence." Hale, struck by her interpretation, faltered in his notes. He had sought financial scandal, yet Marple's reading revealed something deeper, more human, and infinitely more chilling. If she was right, Ashcroft Manor's secrets were not confined to dusty ledges. They were written in grief, encoded in sorrow, and buried beneath generations of deliberate silence. And now, with the diary unearthed, that silence had begun to unravel. It was in the snug of the king's arms that Miss Marple set her little snare. The fire was glowing, the cider mugs clinked, and talk of the diary had reached a fever pitch. Mr. Hale, at her gentle suggestion, made a deliberate remark for all to hear. He spoke with academic excitement of a second hidden panel in the manor, one which he claimed might contain letters or documents more damning than anything yet discovered. He hinted, ever so casually, that he would return tomorrow to investigate properly. The villagers, feigning disinterest, heard every word. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat with her knitting, eyes lowered, her needles clicking softly. But she noticed the quick glances exchanged at the far end of the bar, the subtle stiffening of shoulders. Someone, she knew, would not wait until morning. That night, frost crept over the fields, and Ashcroft Manor loomed like a sentinel of secrets. While Mr. Hale retired with talk of early sleep, Miss Marple made her way quietly into the garden, shawl wrapped tight. She positioned herself near the hedgerow where shadows thickened, an unobtrusive figure beneath the skeletal branches. The hours dragged. An owl called. The wind whispered. And then, movement. A figure slipped through the gate, cautious and practiced. No lantern was carried. Instead, the intruder moved by memory, straight toward the side door of the manor. A key glinted faintly in the moonlight. Miss Marple's sharp eyes followed every step. The intruder paused, glanced about, and then vanished inside. Moments later, faint sounds echoed. The groan of floorboards, the scrape of furniture moved. Whoever it was, they sought something specific, something they feared the historian might indeed uncover. When at last the figure emerged again, carrying a bundle tucked beneath their coat, Miss Marple stepped lightly from her cover. She did not confront, not directly. Instead, she let her walking stick strike against a stone, a sound sharp in the night air. The figure froze, head snapping round. For an instant, the moon caught their face, enough for Marple to mark it indelibly in memory. Without a word, the intruder bolted across the fields, their stolen burden clutched tight. Miss Marple did not give chase. That was never her way. Instead, she returned to the village with a quiet certainty. Her trap had worked. She had flushed the secret keeper from hiding, seen their fear, and confirmed beyond doubt that Ashcroft Manor still held evidence someone was desperate to conceal. The garden, she thought, had yielded more than vegetables this night. It had revealed the shadows still tethered to the house, and the lengths to which they would go to keep the truth buried. Chapter 5. The Truth Beneath the Silence. The manor had never looked so foreboding as it did that night, its darkened windows like watchful eyes, its ivy-clad walls steeped in centuries of silence. But the silence was about to break. Miss Marple, ever modest in her approach, had spoken quietly to a handful of trusted villagers, men and women who had gossiped for years about the manor but had never dared step foot inside after dark. With Hale at her side, she convinced them that the time for whispering had passed. If the truth were to be revealed, they must act together. So it was that a small band of villagers, armed not with weapons but with lanterns and a sturdy sense of duty, gathered at the iron gate just before midnight. The October air was raw, the moon veiled in drifting clouds, casting the house in a shifting pallor. Miss Marple, wrapped in her shawl, seemed almost spectral herself as she urged the group forward. "We must be quiet," she whispered. "He will be inside already." The door, curiously, was not bolted. As they slipped into the great hall, the smell of damp stone and dust enveloped them. But there was another scent beneath it: smoke. They followed it, the lantern light quivering against peeling wallpaper, until they reached the library. There, bent over the grate, was the figure they sought. A match hissed, flame catching the brittle edge of a yellowed page. In that instant, the intruder looked up, startled by the sudden glare of lanterns. Gasps rippled through the villagers as the light revealed his face. Mr. Ellison, the church warden. Respected, trusted, seen every Sunday polishing the brass candlesticks. His hair was wild, his eyes fevered, and in his hand the widow's diary trembled. "Mr. Ellison!" Hale cried, appalled. "What are you doing?" The church warden straightened, his dignity crumbling under the weight of exposure. "It has no right to exist," he spat, voice shaking. "That woman's madness should not be left to poison the living." But Miss Marple stepped forward, her calm presence steadying the trembling lantern beams. "No, Mr. Ellison," she said softly, "not madness. Memory and confession. You sought to destroy it because it speaks of something you already know, something you have carried in silence." His hand faltered over the flame. The villagers murmured, their trust in him unraveling before their eyes. One woman whispered, "Is it true?" Then, "The child." Ellison's jaw tightened, and for a moment he seemed ready to hurl the diary into the fire. But Miss Marple's eyes held his, not stern, but sorrowful. "You were younger then," she pressed gently. "You were part of it, perhaps not by choice, but by blood. And you thought by protecting the family's name, you were protecting the village. But secrets fester, Mr. Ellison. They rot the very ground beneath our feet." The silence in the room was thick, save for the faint crackle of paper smoldering in the grate. At last, Ellison lowered the diary, his shoulders sagging under the release of decades. His voice broke as he confessed. "She wasn't mad. She was desperate. They took her child from her, my uncle's doing, to preserve the family's honor. He said it was for the best, that scandal would ruin us all. And I helped keep it quiet." The villagers exchanged horrified looks, the weight of the truth pressing heavy. Miss Marple reached for the diary with her gloved hands, lifting it gently from Ellison's trembling grip. "And so," she said with quiet finality, "the silence is ended." The following morning, the air in St. Alders was hushed, as though the village itself waited for the final word. In the vicarage, with shutters drawn against the weak daylight, Miss Marple, Mr. Hale, and a few sober villagers gathered around the diary and the stack of records Hale had unearthed from the archives. The fire crackled softly, a stark counterpoint to the grave tale that unfolded on the table between them. The widow's diary, so nearly consigned to the flames, was laid open at a page written in a trembling hand. The words, once thought ramblings, were now clear in their meaning. "They took him from me," it read. "The storm raged, and in the quarrel he slipped, and still he lies where no prayer can reach." Miss Marple traced the line with her finger, her eyes thoughtful. "It was never a disappearance," she murmured. "It was an accident, an unspeakable one, but an accident nonetheless." Hale nodded, producing a parish record that had been oddly amended. The entry of the child's baptism was there, but no burial was listed, no note of passing. Instead, the line ended abruptly, as if severed by deliberate hand. They erased him, Hale said, his voice tight with anger. Not his life, but his remembrance. Ellison, pale and subdued after his confession, sat apart, his hands clenched. He was just a boy, he whispered. My cousin. The quarrel was over an inheritance, a dispute between brothers. Tempers flared in the storm, and the boy was caught between them. He fell, and it was done. My uncle said scandal would destroy the family, the estate, even the village. So we buried him in secret, and the widow was locked away with her grief. The room was silent, the enormity of the deceit pressing on every heart. Mrs. Ellie wept quietly into her handkerchief. Another villager shook his head, muttering that no reputation was worth the loss of truth. Miss Marple closed the diary gently. The poor child, she said softly, first robbed of life, then of memory. His mother left to mourn in shadows, branded mad for speaking what no one wished to hear, and all for the sake of appearances. She rose and looked toward the window, where pale sunlight filtered through. But secrets do not die. They linger, waiting for the moment they are named. And now, at least, he is remembered. For the first time in decades, the fate of the missing child was no longer rumor, no longer hushed away in the corners of pub talk. It was fact, cold and sorrowful, but freeing. The villagers sat with bowed heads, aware that their quiet lives had been built upon the silence of a grave. Miss Marple, ever gentle, did not condemn further. She only said, "It is not too late to set it right. Let the record be amended, and let prayers be said. That, at least, is justice." The next morning, the village tea room was alive once more with the ordinary clink of china cups, the hum of quiet chatter, and the buttery scent of warm scones fresh from the oven. To a passing stranger, it would have seemed as though St. Alders had slipped seamlessly back into its tranquil rhythm. Yet for those who had stood in the manor's library the night before, the air carried a subtle weight, a hush beneath the brightness, as though every spoon stirred with a touch more solemnity. Miss Marple sat at her usual corner table, a pot of Darjeeling steaming gently beside her. She listened, as she always did, to the cadences of conversation around her. There were mentions of the harvest fair, speculation about the weather, the familiar rhythm of village gossip. But every so often, a pause, an unfinished sentence, a downward glance, betrayed the lingering thought of the manor, of the diary, and of the child whose fate had at last been spoken aloud. She stirred her tea slowly, her face composed, though her eyes, bright and perceptive, carried the trace of melancholy. To her mind, it was not the mystery itself that weighed most heavily, nor even the crime of silence. It was the ordinariness of it all. Pride, secrecy, the desperate clinging to reputation. These were not monstrous things born of villains, but small seeds sown in ordinary hearts. Yet when left to grow unchecked, they could tangle into tragedies as dark and ruinous as any murder. She reflected on the widow, trapped by grief and dismissed as unstable, her voice denied simply because it spoke what others refused to hear. She thought of Ellison, a man who had lived respectably for decades, haunted by the part he played in burying both truth and child. And she thought of the villagers themselves, who had lived comfortably alongside shadows, content to let rumors replace remembrance. People so often think wickedness comes with thunderclaps and lightning, she mused softly to herself, but more often it creeps in through very quiet doors. The tea-room bustled around her, laughter over a shared joke, the scrape of chairs, the cheerful ring of the till. But Miss Marple heard in it a new timbre, as though the village itself was adjusting to the knowledge of its past. The truth had been spoken, but truth was not always tidy. It left echoes, and the manor at the edge of St. Alders would never be quite the same. Its halls were still empty, its windows shuttered, yet now the silence seemed different. Not oppressive, but mournful, like a churchyard bell tolling for a soul long forgotten. Miss Marple lifted her cup and sipped, her expression serene. She did not dwell on whether the villagers would soon return to their comfortable gossip, or whether the story of the child would fade into yet another fireside tale. What mattered was that the silence had been broken, and that, in its breaking, a measure of peace had been restored. And so, dear friends, the tale of the house at the edge of St. Alders comes to a close. A place that once seemed only a crumbling silhouette has spoken at last, its secrets no longer silent. Such is the way of villages, charming, picturesque, yet always led with stories both tender and troubling. Tell me, as you listened, would you have suspected the culprit before Miss Marple uncovered the truth? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed tonight's mystery, do remember to like this video, subscribe for more cozy tales of shadow and intrigue, and share it with a fellow mystery lover. Until next time, keep your tea warm and your curiosity warmer.